All right, hello and welcome back to yet another video. I know I say this every time, but today we're actually talking about my number one favorite thing in the whole world, and that is sleep. And more importantly, we're gonna be talking about the mechanisms of sleep and how sleep works. And in my next video, we're gonna be talking about how you can use tools to get better sleep. Before making this video, I spent 43 hours listening to interviews with the world's leading experts on sleep, and I interviewed my molecular biology teacher to get a better understanding of how sleep works. But that is just knowledge. It is said you need 10,000 hours of experience to be an expert at something, and I have spent over 60,000 hours sleeping. So I'm an expert in sleep by this point. Plus, if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll give you my theory as to why evolution hasn't done away with sleep, which I think is very interesting. So let's get right into it. So what's going on when you sleep? You know, your brain is unconscious. You're not aware of any activity going on, but it is in fact very active. In fact, some parts of your brain are more active when you're asleep than when you're awake. So what is it doing? It's consolidating memories, divorcing emotional load from memories, replenishing the ammunition of your immune system, and while you sleep, you are flagrantly hallucinating. So, what is the order of events? Approximately 10 to 20 minutes after your head hits the pillow, you will fall asleep and start your first 90-minute sleep cycle. And it's going to go in a certain order. It's going to start with stage 1 of deep non-REM sleep, then stage 2 of deep non-REM sleep, then stage 3 of deep non-REM sleep, and you're going to pop back up into REM sleep. And these cycles are going to be 90 minutes long, and they're going to stay in that same order throughout the night. But in the first half of the night, you're going to spend the majority of those 90 minutes in the deep stages of sleep. And in the second half of the night, you're going to spend the majority of those 90 minutes in the REM stage of sleep. So first half of the night, more deep sleep. Second half of the night, more REM sleep. You're going to have 4 to 6 cycles, depending on how long you sleep. And there is no better or worse time to wake up in those cycles. That's a common myth. So let's talk about the products of sleep. What good things happen when you sleep and what bad things happen when you don't sleep. So when you are asleep, your parasympathetic nervous system is the more dominant half of the nervous system. It's the rest and digest part of the nervous system. And this signals to your immune system to replenish its ammunition, if you will, which are things like white blood cells, natural killer cells, and killer T cells. And these are the things that are your first line of defense against things like cancer and any, toxic things you might face in the dirty world as you go about your day. Viruses and sickness and dirty people and what have you. One study found that reduced sleep led to a 70% decrease in activity in natural killer cells, which again are your first line of defense against cancer. So definitely want to get good sleep if you don't want to get cancer. Another study found that reduced sleep led to reduced ability to regulate blood sugar for 2 reasons. For one, your pancreas releases less insulin when you're sleep deprived, and your cells are more insulin insensitive. So you release less insulin and you're less able to use the little insulin you do release. So you're less able to regulate blood sugar. You're less able to manage hunger because the 2 hormones that regulate hunger, ghrelin and leptin, are, long story short, less able to do their job when you are sleep deprived, which partially explains the link between obesity and sleep deprivation. You hold on to more fat disproportionately if all other variables are controlled when sleep deprived versus when slept. The theory behind this is that muscle is very metabolically active and hard to maintain, and fat is very calorically dense and easy to maintain. So when you have low energy or your body realizes it's like at a scarcity when you're sleep deprived, it would much rather get rid of muscle than fat. So you lose more muscle when you're sleep deprived. Men have testosterone that is that of men 10 years older than them when they're sleep deprived. I'll put all the studies for these things next to my head. Women, you'll notice drops in luteinizing hormones, estrogen, and follicle stimulating hormone. I'll be completely honest, I don't know what any of that means, but I know it is bad. And then there's a bunch of studies on sleep deprivation and driving. One study, they put sleep-deprived individuals into a driving simulator, and on 6 hours of sleep, they were 30% more likely to crash. And the AAA released some data that said on 5 hours of sleep, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to crash, and on 4 hours of sleep, you're close to a 10 times greater risk of crashing. That's real-world data of people who really did get in crashes and then said how many hours of sleep they were on. There's another study that you may have heard of that said On the Monday following daylight savings, when you lose an hour of sleep, there's a 24% increase in incidence of heart attacks the following day. And then in fall, when you gain an hour of sleep, there's a 21% reduced incidence of heart attacks. This is real world data of people actually got heart attacks and they reported how much sleep they were getting. And then there was another huge study with 60,000 participants that showed reduced sleep quantity. I mean, you get less than 8 hours of sleep or less than however many hours of sleep you're supposed to get, reduced lifespan, which is not surprising. But the same study showed that sleep irregularity, so going to bed and waking up at erratic times throughout the day, had an even greater effect on longevity, cancer mortality, cardiovascular mortality than sleep quantity. So irregular sleep was more detrimental to your health than sleep quantity, which is not to say that you can give up sleep quantity for sleep regularity. You need both, but they're both very important. All right, hopefully I have scared you a little bit into getting good sleep, but now let's talk about how sleep regulates emotions and memory. So a direct quote from Matthew Walker, one of the world's leading sleep experts, is we've been studying sleep and the connection between emotional regulation and sleep for 20 years. And in that 20 years of research, we have not been able to discover a single psychiatric condition in which sleep is normal. And he says they've done more studies to define which is causing which, and it's bidirectional. Bad sleep causes psychiatric disorders, and psychiatric disorders causes bad sleep. They did an interesting study where they put sleep-deprived individuals into a brain scanner and showed them a bunch of emotional images. I don't know what they were, but I'm imagining it's things like war and death and blood and guts and stuff. And they found a 60% increase in activity in the amygdala, which is the threat detection anxiety part of the brain. So you're more emotionally reactive when sleep deprived. And they did the flip study where they put sleep deprived individuals into a brain scanner compared to, of course, slept individuals, and showed them positive images and noticed also hyper-responsivity to positive stimulus when sleep deprived, which partially explains the correlation between addiction and sleep deprivation, or sensation-seeking behavior and sleep deprivation, because you're hyper-reactive to positive stimulus when sleep deprived. They wanted to see if they could find a, biological explanation for these findings, and what they found was when you are sleep deprived, the connection between your medial prefrontal cortex and your amygdala is weakened. So your medial prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that, the way Huberman describes it, is it tells other brain circuits to shh. It's like the filter of your brain. Little kids don't have this yet, so they do a lot of like unfiltered things. And the amygdala is the emotional part of your brain. I'm really, really, getting creative with how I'm describing these things and not scientific terms. But when you're sleep deprived, the connection between your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala is weakened. So the part of your brain that filters emotional reactions and what have you is less able to dampen down the emotional part of your brain. So that is why sleep is important for emotional regulation. So last thing on emotions and sleep, and I think this is probably the most interesting thing in the whole video, is this. If I asked you to recall an important event in your life, you wouldn't just remember what happened, you would remember how it felt to have that thing happen. For example, if I asked you to recall what it felt like to get in a car crash or, graduate high school, you wouldn't just remember what happened. You would remember how it felt to experience that thing. And the goal of therapy is to divorce the emotional load of an event from the memory of that event so that you don't bring to surface all the emotions that you had at the time. And amazingly, REM sleep does just that. It divorces the emotion from the memory so that when you bring it to surface, you're not feeling all the emotions you felt at the time. You're just remembering a log of events and how it felt to feel at the time rather than bringing those emotions back, if that makes sense. I'm really, really abbreviating that study, so I'll put it up right here and you can go read it for yourself. But sleep is kind of like overnight therapy, which in my opinion is amazing and will save you hundreds of dollars for going to actual therapy. Next, let's talk about memory. So to be able to remember information that you're learning, you have to be going off of a good night of sleep, and you have to get a good night of sleep after you've learned stuff. Well, why does this happen? The idea and the analogy that Matthew Walker gives is that your hippocampus is like a thumb drive or a USB, and your cortex is like your mainframe or your mother drive or whatever you want to call it, your main computer. And your hippocampus is what intakes is like your emotional or your informational inbox. You go through learning stuff and you're uploading all this stuff onto a thumb drive. And then when you sleep, those memories are being pushed from the hippocampus up to the cortex so they can be less vulnerable to degradation, or those will be stored in long-term memory. And of course, they did a bajillion studies to find out exactly how this works. And they found that when you sleep deprive individuals, there's less activity in their hippocampus, which essentially means they're not retaining the information that they're learning. And when you let individuals who had a good night of sleep learn a bunch of stuff, they have a bunch of activity in their hippocampus. But if you deprive them of sleep the next night and then test them later, they will do poorly on those tests, meaning they didn't consolidate those memories from the hippocampus to the cortex. So you need to get a good night of sleep before to be able to take in new information and to remember the information that you intook during the day. You have to get a good night of sleep after. So the two mechanisms that this goes off of is the one I just mentioned, where you're uploading memories from the hippocampus to the cortex. And the other one, which I think is very, very interesting, is repetition. And what they found is when they dropped electrodes into the brain of mice and then put them through a maze and they sonified their brain activity, you could say a left might sound like beep and a right might sound like boop. So you put these mouses through the maze, and as they learn the maze, you're hearing like beep, beep, boop, boop, beep, bop, 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 to go like left, right, 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 left, right, to get through the maze. And they kept the electrodes in the brains of the mice, and they watched what happened when they slept. And very interestingly, they found that while they slept, they were repeating the same sequence of lefts and rights as when they were learning the maze throughout the day. So if during the day it was left, left, right, right, left, at night, you'll hear that same pattern repeated, but it's not repeated at the same speed. It's repeated up to 20 times faster. So super rapidly, you're repeating the same memory over and over and over and over and over. And a personal anecdote of this is when I learned a scale on guitar, which sounds like, I can sometimes catch myself waking up in the middle of the night thinking about that certain scale in that particular order, those particular notes in that order, over and over again, which is very interesting. So that is kind of how sleep and memory consolidation works. Lastly, I want to talk about how sleep and sleepiness is regulated. And this is going to be the most important information for the next video on ways to improve sleep. So there's two mechanisms by which sleepiness is regulated. There's adenosine and then there's your circadian rhythm. And they are not necessarily going to overlap, but ideally you want them to be aligned. So the first one is adenosine. And that is the molecule that builds up as you go throughout the day and burn energy. Even if you're not like going and physically exercising or doing something, your brain and body use a lot of energy, which burns ATP, and you'll build up adenosine, and that will make you feel sleepy. The second mechanism is your circadian rhythm, which circa means about and dia means day. So you're about a day rhythm. And your circadian rhythm goes up, up, up in the morning, and then at night it drops back down. And it kind of goes in this wave of up and down, sleep and wake every 24 hours. Adenosine, same thing, starts building when you wake up and peaks when you go to sleep. And as you sleep, your brain slowly gets rid of adenosine. And then when you wake up, you still have a little bit of adenosine left over for about 90 minutes, 2 hours. And then your adenosine's as low as it will possibly be. The important thing is that your circadian rhythm is regulated by light exposure as well as genetics. So some people are going to be naturally night owls, some people are going to be early people. I personally have a circadian rhythm that I naturally tend to get tired around 10 o'clock and wake up at 7 o'clock. Some people naturally get tired at 1 a.m. and wake up at 10 a.m. And it's all over the place. So you have to find out what your specific chronotype is, and I can link to a chronotype test in the caption. And ideally, you want to align your waking up and bedtime with that, and your adenosine will follow if you wake up at the right time and go to bed at the right time. I will talk more about how to regulate your circadian rhythm and adenosine system in the next video with practical tools. Hint, hint. It's going to be morning sunlight, darkness, and caffeine. But for now, I want to talk about my theory, my hypothesis of why evolution has not gotten rid of sleep. So if you think about it, it's very interesting that we have not evolved away from sleep, because the goal of evolution is to survive and procreate, which mostly means eat as much food as you can, protect yourself, have kids, and protect them. And while you're asleep, you're not hunting, you're not protecting yourself. In fact, you're very vulnerable. And unless you are a very, very skilled sleepwalker, you're probably not procreating in your sleep. So it would make sense for evolution to select for those who don't have to sleep as much. Well, my hypothesis, is that way back when our ancient common ancestor was a bacteria or a tiny little cell of some sort, it made sense to move during the day when the sun was out and stay still during night. Maybe it was getting food from photosynthesizing plants during the day, so it moved around to get more food, and it stayed still at night to save energy. Who knows? That mechanism just stayed because there's no selective pressure against it until it was a more evolved creature, like a flatworm, for example, which is supposed to be one of the most ancient ancestors we have. And then maybe it became evolutionarily advantageous to sleep because you're able to consolidate memories. So maybe the ancient flatworm that had the hippocampus and the cortex was able to consolidate memories better, which gave it a better chance of being around a place that had more food and avoiding places that they were vulnerable to attack. So memory gave them an edge in evolution. Then the question is, well, why couldn't we just, natural selection couldn't just select for an animal that could remember things without sleep? And my guess to that is that maybe you're not able to consolidate memories because your hippocampus is being used while you're awake, so you have to be asleep and offline for it to do the memory consolidation process, which is in fact what I just talked about when I said, like, you have to sleep for your hippocampus to upload the memories to your cortex. So that's kind of my theory, is that maybe you have to sleep to consolidate memories. So remembering things gave animals an evolutionary edge, and that is why we sleep. Now, this is still a work in progress hypothesis, because you could just say, well, why couldn't we just evolve to remember things while we're awake? And I don't know, but that is my hypothesis on why evolution hasn't gotten rid of sleep. And last note is, maybe we're still evolving. Maybe we are still trending in the direction of selecting for animals who can survive without sleep, like Jocko Willink. Who knows? Anyways, hope you stay tuned for my next video, which is going to be about how to sleep better. And I hope you enjoyed this one. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.